Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to analyze Kris's character from Deltarune to see whether or not Kris was truly locked in or was actually geeked out the whole time. In referring to Kris, we will be saying they or them, for we do not know Kris's gender, and the game itself calls Kris by that, or not even the game knows. And with that, let's dig into Kris's character. Most people would most likely say that Kris was indeed locked in for the entire game due to Kris's unchanging countenance and their steadfastness, but many people fail to realize that Kris wasn't just locked in, Kris was nonchalant. Being nonchalant and being locked in are very similar and go hand in hand. However, ketchup and mustard go hand in hand but are not the same. Let's briefly break down the difference and see where exactly Kris rightfully belongs. When one is locked in, absolutely nothing is wavering them in their path that they are determined to follow. They are not distracted and they never chase squirrels, and they will stop at nothing to get the job done. When one is locked in, they usually don a very somber countenance, not showing any lighthearted emotions due to having one thing on their heart, soul, and mind, like how Christians should be locked in into serving God and following Jesus' teachings. When one is nonchalant, nothing is bothering them or perturbing them. They too have a steadfast and somber look on their face, for they are only showing a cool emotion. Being nonchalant may be similar to being locked in, but being locked in means you are focused on a task or job that must be completed. Nonchalant is simply not caring much. Now, whenever Kris is not locked in or geeked out, they are nonchalant, for nothing calls for them being locked in or geeked out. Thus, with that explanation behind us, let's determine when Kris is geeked out or locked in. In Chapter 1 of Deltarune, the beginning starts off with Kris and their mom, Toriel, being a little late for school, which is fine with everyone else. Kris is being quite the normal kid and not showing much emotion. This means they are nonchalant about everything at the moment. But when Alphys runs out of chalk and asks Susie and Kris to get some out of the closet, this is when Susie slams Kris into the lockers and bullies them. But before that happens, Kris actually backs up into the lockers before Susie assaults them. This actually shows Kris being concerned for their own well-being and now starting to care about something. When Kris is slammed into the lockers though, they become nonchalant again. This is the first time Kris does something on their own without the player's control. Kris also backs up away from the dark closet, but it's until they get into the dark closet, or the dark world, where we see Kris lock in. Kris doesn't exactly know what's happening, but they're going nonetheless because they have to. When Lancer attacks, Kris dodges all of his spades like nothing happened. Kris faces Lancer and is even more locked in. This is their first battle and they already know what to do and easily defeats Lancer and his goofy old motorcycle. When it comes to the other enemies, Kris can fight or act. If Kris chooses to fight, Kris is always locked in and will not stop, even at violence, to get through. If Kris chooses to act, Kris can get a little quirky. Kris usually talks about random things or convinces enemies to quit, but when Kris flatters Hathy, it's pretty interesting. Can you be locked in while flirting? Absolutely, and Hathy loves it. Being geeked while flattering can be cute and eccentric, but you also have a high chance of making the target feel uncomfortable and may come off as creepy. Now, Hathy is a female enemy, and one of the worst things to do when flattering girls is make her uncomfortable. Therefore, Kris locked in when flattering Hathy, because if Kris were to mess up, it would be very awkward. Kris can also befriend Jigsaw-Ree, but the text says that Kris barely lifted a finger, so we really don't know if Kris was going to lock in or geek out. So far, Kris has done nothing but lock in. But when Kris is up against Pond Man, Kris can do something quite interesting. If you act on Pawn Man and choose the Good Night option, the game says that Kris whispered good night to Pawn Man, and they became very tired and fall asleep, allowing Ralsei to pacify them. This action gives off a very maternal vibe to me for some odd reason. Kris straight up performs live ASMR to Pawn Man. This was Kris being geeked, only a little bit. Kris didn't really care if it was weird or questionable. They did it because they knew that if they did do it, that it would work. There was no shame in Kris's action. Thus, Kris was officially geeked for the first time. A neat thing Lancer says when he has a bucket of team name lists before the protagonist is, "Blue person, you can choose since you seem like you don't care." Susie, Ralsei, and Lancer all seem to care about the team name, all except for Kris, providing more evidence for Kris being a nonchalant redhead. During the fight with K. Round, Kris and Ralsei can bow to him, making K. Round bow back. And now, just to be clear, K. Round is most definitely geeked, and so are most other enemies. But yes, Kris can bow, but this bow is a simple bow and not over-exaggerated, so Kris is still locked in as usual. After the fight with Lancer and Susie, Kris locked in there too. Kris and the Fun Gang get thrown into prison. In Kris's cell, there is lots of moss in the corner. If you let Kris eat the moss, Kris is beyond geeked. Only a geek person would eat moss. And it is at this point where Kris climaxes in geek power. Even if Ralsei questions your actions, Kris doesn't care. After being geeked out of their mind, Kris must lock back in to solve Rule Card's lame puzzle. Now Kris must stay locked in to face against the King. Not to mention, King is highly geeked during this fight, as you can see. Once Kris defeats King, he catches the Lightners off their guard when Ralsei tried to help. When King is ready to kill Susie with more of his spades, Kris locks back in and stands in front of her to defend her. But Kris wasn't locked in hard enough, and the King clapped Kris even harder with the barrage of spade attacks. But whatever happened while you were on the adventure through a forest or field, the King either falls asleep or the citizens overthrow him. When Kris returns home and finally ends the chapter, this is Kris's final time geeking out, and is without a doubt the most we see Kris geek out in Chapter 1. When no one is watching, Kris climbs out of bed and tears their soul out to throw it inside a birdcage. Then Kris brandishes a knife and eerily grinned at us with red glowing eyes. This is the highest of Kris's geek max power in Chapter 1, for it is unlike anything else we have seen before. During the secret boss fight with Jeevil, we see the most geeked out character in all of Deltarune. Jeevil is not locked in, he is far from locked in. Jeevil locks in one time, and it is when he gets tired here. But then he geeks out even more and bounces all over the place. Jeevil was the court jester after all, and it makes sense that he is eccentric. But Sham says that he lost his mind and said things that didn't make sense but did not make sense. Jeevil is the definition of geeked. Now Kris here has the option to pirouette and twirl around, hypnotizing Jeevil. Now anyone who just starts pirouetting out of nowhere would seem pretty geek to me. But pirouettes take skill, practice, and focus. But Kris doesn't seem to struggle with this dance at all. In fact, Kris pirouettes quite well here. Was Kris locked in pirouetting or geeked out pirouetting? Kris seems to be very locked in while dancing here actually. But one can still geek with a straight face. Now that we have covered Kris's character in Chapter 1, let's give an overall rating. Most of the time, Kris stayed locked in, and were more locked in than geeked out, which is normal for Kris. But the times that Kris did geek out are very noteworthy and should definitely be taken into account. If Kris geeks in later chapters, we must study it.